Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Today we've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. Ethan Turner had always prided himself on blending into the background. At 38, he wasn't the type to draw attention. His brown hair often fell messily into his eyes, and his glasses, thick and slightly askew, made him look more studious than stylish. He was mild-mannered, reliable, and worked as an accountant. In a world that often felt chaotic, he found peace in order and routine. His life was simple, meticulously organized, and he was content with that. And in that carefully controlled life, Sarah was the vibrant splash of color. She was everything he thought he wanted. Beautiful, intelligent, ambitious. Everything that Ethan believed would complete him. Her laughter filled the corners of their home, and her dreams of a perfect future with him felt like something out of a fairy tale. Ethan had believed in their love, had believed in her. But belief is a fragile thing. It all shattered on a rainy afternoon, one of those dreary, forgettable days that would end up defining the rest of his life. Ethan had decided to leave work early. It was an unusual decision, one that felt strange in the moment, but looking back, it would seem inevitable. As the rain tapped against his car windows, a soothing rhythm, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if the world was quietly warning him. He pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of their house now looking foreign, somehow cold. He opened the door and stepped inside, expecting the usual sounds of Sarah moving about. Maybe the hum of her voice on the phone, the smell of dinner simmering on the stove. But there was nothing, just silence. He moved further into the house, his heart inexplicably heavy, a gnawing feeling in his gut. And then he saw it. There, in the living room, was Sarah. But she wasn't alone. His wife, the woman he'd shared his life with, was tangled in the arms of another man. Her lips pressed against his, their bodies intertwined in a way Ethan had never witnessed before. It was so intimate, so cruelly effortless, that it took him a moment to register what he was seeing. His world tilted, his breath caught, his heart, already heavy, dropped to his stomach. The pain was immediate, like an electric shock coursing through his veins. The betrayal felt raw, brutal, and impossibly real. The room, the moment, everything around him spun in dizzying chaos. For a long, excruciating second, Ethan stood frozen, his mind refusing to catch up to the image before him. He had never felt more alone. The woman he had trusted with his heart was no longer his. She had become someone else's. His feet felt like lead, but somehow, he turned and slipped out of the house without making a sound. No confrontation, no questions. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. The weight of the moment paralyzed him. The rain had stopped by the time he made it back to his car. His hands were shaking, his body numb, but he didn't leave. Not immediately. He sat in the parking lot, his mind whirling in 1,000 directions. Hours passed as he stared blankly into the dark. His home, his sanctuary, suddenly felt like a prison. It wasn't just the pain that kept him there. It was something darker. The anger, the raw, bubbling rage that he hadn't known was inside him, festered, pushed against his ribs, threatening to explode. But Ethan wasn't a man who let his emotions get the best of him. He would never be the kind of person who crumbled at the sight of betrayal. No, that wasn't him. Eventually, he went back. He had to. He couldn't run from this. Not now. Not when everything he had believed in was gone. By the time he entered the house again, the world outside seemed so distant, so irrelevant. The sound of Sarah moving around upstairs, her innocent footsteps echoing through the quiet house, was maddening. How could she act like nothing had happened? How could she carry on as if their entire life together wasn't a lie? Ethan could hear the faint noise of her phone vibrating in the other room, another reminder of the world he no longer recognized. The anger inside him continued to build, but so did the cold, clinical part of him. That side of him, the one that dealt with numbers and facts, started taking over. He didn't speak to her. Not yet. That confrontation would come, but not today. Ethan wasn't ready to confront the woman who had broken him. No, he was still piecing himself together. But he would. He would confront her, and then he would make her regret this. regret every second of it. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of detachment. Ethan was on autopilot, moving through the motions of life, yet all he could think about was how to make her pay. He watched Sarah, every move she made, and he took note of every little thing. She had no idea. She thought everything was fine, that she had gotten away with it. She was wrong. Ethan wasn't just going to leave her. He wasn't just going to walk away, bruised and broken. No, he had a plan, one so intricate, so calculated, that it would leave her shattered. The first step was already in motion. The morning after his discovery, Ethan didn't let any of his emotions show. He needed to appear normal, calm. He couldn't let her see the storm brewing inside him. She was too busy with her own world, her own guilt, or maybe she had none at all. He couldn't be sure. But as she made her coffee, he looked at her, his face an impassive mask. "I was thinking," he began, his voice steady but with a hidden edge. "How about a vacation? Just the two of us." She stopped mid-pour, blinking at him in surprise. "A vacation? Really? I thought you were busy with work." Ethan forced a smile. Felt like his face was breaking, but he kept it in place. "Not anymore. I think we could both use a break. A trip to the coast, maybe." He watched her closely, gauging her reaction. She was thrilled. Of course, she would be. It was the perfect distraction, a way to cover up the cracks in their marriage, to continue playing the role of the loving couple. Ethan knew exactly what she would think. "That sounds amazing," she said, her excitement palpable, unaware that she was walking straight into a trap. Ethan continued with the charade. He arranged everything, an idyllic vacation that would be anything but. Everything about the trip was designed to be perfect. From the location to the details, it was all about making Sarah feel special, secure. But Ethan had no intention of going on the trip. No, this was all part of his plan. The day of her departure came, and Ethan offered to drive her to the airport, smiling the entire time. As they drove, his grip on the steering wheel tightened, his heart beating like a drum. The sight of Sarah smiling, chatting about the trip, laughing with Mark, it was almost too much to bear. But he kept it together. This was just the beginning. When he dropped her off, his voice was cold, almost robotic. "Have fun, babe." And with that, he watched them walk away, knowing that everything he had set in motion was about to unfold. Sarah had no idea what was coming. Ethan had always believed in patience, waiting for the right moment, never rushing, letting the plan evolve as it should. And now, as he sat in his car outside his house, watching the lights flicker inside, he knew he was just steps away from the next phase of his revenge. Sarah and Mark were far from the image of happiness they'd been in the beginning, unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. While they vacationed, Ethan was working quietly, methodically. It wasn't about striking them down in one swift blow. It was about destruction over time, making them feel the pressure, making them sweat, and eventually, making them crack under the weight of their own choices. The next day, Ethan made sure everything was set into motion. He had been to the bank early that morning, carefully planting the seeds of financial chaos. Sarah's accounts were now linked to a dormant, shadow account Ethan had set up months ago. The funds would drain slowly, unnoticed at first, just enough to leave her scrambling. By the time she'd figured it out, it would be too late. Her credit card had already been flagged. The slow burn of financial ruin was underway, and Ethan could feel a satisfaction in knowing that each swipe she made, every bill that arrived, would be another thread unraveling her perfect little world. At the same time, Ethan had tipped off a few key figures from his past, contacts who still had a pulse on things in the business world. He fed them bits and pieces of information about Mark, just enough to ignite the spark of suspicion. It would take time, but it was a risk worth taking. Ethan wasn't worried about the speed. It wasn't about fast revenge. It was about watching them squirm, watching the pressure build until they could no longer bear it. And then came the phone call. It was the kind of call that hit when you least expected it, when everything seemed fine on the surface. Ethan could almost hear the sharp breath Sarah took when she picked up the phone. He could picture her standing in the middle of the quaint cottage, Mark's voice in the background, laughing carelessly. "Hello." Sarah's voice was shaky, a slight tremor to it that she couldn't hide. "Is this Sarah Turner?" The voice on the other end was cold, professional, and entirely unamused. "Yes, this is she. I'm calling in regards to a financial discrepancy. Your accounts have raised a few red flags. We're going to have to freeze them until we sort things out. You should have received a letter about it by now." The silence on the other end was deafening. Ethan could hear Sarah's breath catch. He could feel the moment she realized that something was terribly wrong. What do you mean freeze?" she stammered, her voice already faltering. "At this time, I can't give you more details, but you should have your legal counsel reach out as soon as possible." And just like that, the first thread had been pulled. Ethan could feel a thrill surge through him, knowing that the web he was weaving around her was tightening. The slowest, most calculated betrayal, but the most satisfying. As Sarah fumbled with her phone, trying to figure out the next move, Ethan smirked, watching the chaos unfold from a distance. Meanwhile, Sarah remained blissfully ignorant of the further plans Ethan had set in motion. She didn't know that he'd taken the time to alert the local authorities about Mark's illegal activities, making sure to feed them the right amount of information to keep things on the radar, just enough to make Mark uncomfortable. The investigation was in motion, but it wouldn't be until later that Sarah would realize her involvement. For now, she and Mark were still enjoying their time at the cottage, unaware that Ethan had already set them up for a brutal fall. Each moment they spent indulging in their little getaway, Ethan grew stronger in his resolve. He would make them regret every single second of their betrayal. As Sarah and Mark made their way into town, their carefree laughter filled the air. The excitement from the morning hadn't left them. Ethan watched from the shadows, standing across the street, knowing they were oblivious to the trap he had carefully laid out for them. There was no turning back now. His plan had to be executed with precision, and each move had to be executed in perfect synchrony. He had placed one last piece in the puzzle. This next part would be the most intense. Later that day, Ethan visited a lawyer, one of the best in town. There was no telling when it would all hit Sarah, but he was ready. With each step, he was further distancing himself from the man he had once been, from the man who had trusted her. Now, Ethan was a man on a mission, a man who would make sure that Sarah felt every ounce of his wrath. The beach, which had once felt like a place of freedom, would soon become a cage for them. The luxury of isolation was now a carefully crafted prison. As the investigation into Mark's dealings grew, Sarah found herself increasingly caught in the web, unable to outrun it. Ethan's precision, his coldness, had ensured that her world would fall apart slowly, piece by piece. And soon, she would see that nothing would save her. Not her charm, not her ambition, and certainly not her lies. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His revenge was far from over, but it was only just beginning to unfold. And as the days passed, he could feel the tightening grip of retribution, his anger and hurt turning into a force that would not be denied. The days stretched out slowly, each one slipping past with a sense of dread hanging in the air. Ethan had always prided himself on his ability to wait, to let his plans unfold naturally. But there was something different this time. He could feel the pressure building, like the fuse of a bomb waiting to detonate. Sarah and Mark, still unaware of the storm gathering around them, carried on as if their charade would last forever. But Ethan knew better. He had ensured their days of bliss were numbered, and with each passing moment, they were walking further into the trap he had so carefully set. Ethan's phone buzzed in the silence of his study. He didn't have to look to know who it was. It was the lawyer, the one who had been feeding him information, the one who had been unraveling Mark's hidden past, the one who was making sure that when everything came crashing down, it would happen with surgical precision. "Everything's in place," the lawyer's voice came through the line, steady and calm. "We've been tracking the assets, and it's only a matter of time before the rest of his accounts are flagged. There's no way he'll be able to cover his tracks." Ethan let out a slow breath. "And Sarah? She's already linked to the discrepancies. We've kept it quiet for now, but she's not out of the woods. The financial fraud isn't something she can escape. It's only a matter of time before it all unravels for her. 2. Good, Ethan replied, his voice colder than he'd intended. Make sure she feels it. I want her to know exactly who's responsible for the mess she's about to find herself in. The next few days were a blur of preparations. Ethan had already set everything in motion. The legal moves, the hidden contacts, the meticulous details that would turn Sarah and Mark's lives upside down. But it wasn't enough. He wanted them to suffer. He wanted them to feel the weight of their betrayal on their shoulders, crushing them from all sides. And he knew exactly how to do it. He sent one final message to Mark, an anonymous tip about his offshore accounts, the illegal deals he had been hiding for years. It was subtle at first, a shadow of suspicion that would grow over time. Then the first domino fell. Sarah walked into the living room, unaware that her life was about to implode. The phone call had been unsettling, yes, but nothing prepared her for the shock that followed. Sarah Turner, the voice on the other end of the line, began, its tone sharp, direct. We've been investigating your husband's business dealings. There are significant discrepancies in his financial reports. We have reason to believe there's been illegal activity. Her heart dropped into her stomach. What? She gasped, her voice trembling. That can't be right. My husband would never. The officer on the other end wasn't convinced. I suggest you speak with your attorney. We'll be following up with further action shortly. The line went dead. For a moment, Sarah stood there, frozen in place, her mind racing. Mark had always been careful, meticulous even. There was no way this could be happening. But the fear creeping into her chest was undeniable. The walls were closing in, and she could sense it. But as much as Sarah tried to deny it, she knew deep down that she couldn't escape what was coming. Ethan's shadow had been cast over her life for far too long. And now the consequences were catching up with her. Back at home, Ethan smiled darkly as he watched Sarah's reaction unfold. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the walls would finally start closing in on her. His plan was flawless, his patience had paid off, and now the fruits of his labor were finally ripe. He could already hear the distant sirens in his mind, the ones that would soon be pulling Mark's name through the mud, dragging Sarah into the same pit of disgrace. He knew they would crumble. Mark, with his criminal activities, and Sarah, her betrayal, had been the final piece. She thought she could get away with it, thought she could play the game without consequences. But Ethan had been watching all along, and now it was time for the final blow. Later that evening, Ethan received the confirmation he had been waiting for. The police had begun their investigation into Mark's illegal activities. The trail was now too wide to cover up. The authorities had started pulling on the loose threads Ethan had placed, and they were unraveling quickly. The once untouchable Mark was now under suspicion. The pressure was mounting, and Ethan could feel the moment approaching, when everything would be exposed. The walls that had once protected Mark and Sarah were crumbling, and soon, they would realize that Ethan was the mastermind behind it all. But Ethan wasn't done yet. There was still one final step. The truth about Sarah's involvement in the financial scandal would come to light soon enough. Ethan had ensured it. But as it unfolded, Ethan planned for Sarah to face a public disgrace. Not only would her wealth be stolen, but her reputation would be dragged through the mud. She would beg for mercy, but there would be none. Ethan stood by the window of his home, watching the world outside as it continued on, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. The cool breeze stirred the curtains, and for a moment, he allowed himself a deep breath. It had all come together so perfectly. Sarah and Mark had been so careless, so certain they could pull off their charade. But now they would be forced to face the consequences of their actions. It was only a matter of time. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Leave a comment below. Also, make sure to check out our second channel. We'll be seeing you there in just a few hours. The link is pinned in the comments section. Catch you in the next one.